There's so many lines of communication, streamlines, and directions. It's try to understand how to use it through so many levels of compute stream connections. Quantum calculation is really understanding how to do readings in space. How do you do that in equation line screens? How do you direct the position location to its panels? How do you operate the system to its calculation? Three questions in setting. This is how we have to start to really understand what quantum reading is. Quantum reading is a triangulation interface that sets positions to its question, which is not a question, which is infinity 8. So understand how to use the particle streamlines and direct signals, then you understand the parallels and the paradigms and the polar shifts, how it always comes into affinity 8 as set line conditions. Now that infinity 8 is a rotation surface. The triangulation in position of its program is understanding how to communicate with your universe, not talking at your universe, talking to your universe at locations. This is how you have to understand how to use all compute line screens and all calculation modification setting in your direct positions of panels, direct lines of signals, setting in that communication setting, getting your foregrounds, getting your backgrounds, understanding the flow of space, understanding the navigations of space, understanding the triangulations of space. Okay, I showed you very powerful how you can expand molecules of its design, but you have to communicate with its intelligence first. Okay, that's quantum reading on set line conditions. So once we understand how to interline its communication surface, we can understand how to use it through modulations. It's all calculated, modified how it comes into its own space and time through all settings to its calculations. But navigation is extremely informative because that's all it's doing through set location lines. Once you get out of the picture frames in all calculation and modification streamlines, you get a high direct signal in set locations. So we have another quiz coming up on the calculations of the heart, the generations of the heart, the timeline sequence of the heart, how the heart becomes its own operating setting in position of its own calculation system. You have to understand how to use the ventricular settings into the three valves, set lines of communication setting and travels. See, this is what we have to focus on, is that we don't understand what's inside. We don't understand what it is and how it changes its formation, how it changes its colors, how it changes its lights, how it changes its travels. Because it's its own formation of its own quantum setting. It's all levels of compute locations. How to use it through its operation is all levels of you, through vibration, frequencies, and harmonics, and set locations of its energies. Okay? Energy formates a system, vibration sets the tone, frequency sets location, and harmonics does the communication. Okay, so there's so many different ways of doing this. Okay, like I said, when I was on TikTok locations, and I show you exactly what you can do with two atoms, how it expands, and it comes into its infinitive cycle. But what is it doing through creation? Well, it's for you to find out. So when you find these things out, you're really starting the energy of its collaboration because you're building a relationship with yourself first at all levels in its dimensional space of time, guys. Once you get into that set locations, the particle stream just stretches out the bandwidth in set locations. So it's very powerful when you come into latitude and longitude, okay? Coming in position locations of length and width, okay? Length and width, all right? So we have to understand the expansion that we're coming into. You can't see outside, can you? Some days you can and some days you can't. That's all determination of me and set location of space. You set up the energetic graph. You set up the computer operation system inside you that controls everything that you can imagine through phenomena, right? Because it's all about protecting you and you only, right? Who else is going to do it? Because if you're not controlling your system, who's driving the vehicle, right? Who's driving the bus? Who's driving your car, right? These are the things you have to get out of the equation. You are in control of everything that you do through your consciousness. That's all this is balancing the conscious and understanding how to use the telepathy and how to change anything information location to a screen setting, right? Screen setting, see? All right, so understanding that is understanding this application. Now the team has to really get into this application of zeros and ones. Get past the picture. Track to its communication line setting. It's knowing exactly how to outline its position travel calculations. Point lines of tracks and lines, high calculation lines, and navigation, high position travel calculations, right? So points, lines, divisions. Let's get into a box frame. Okay, just an easy box frame. Sets lines of communication of zeros and ones in track line conditions, right? Know exactly where it is in seconds, minutes, and hours in set position. Okay, now understanding this is understanding how to travel the set position locations, how to travel the set location system and travel calculations, how to travel the set location and setting. Okay, so really understand this process, how it all works. It's holographic set location of its designs is set position, calculation modified in track location. Okay, so getting in position location and all calculation line streams is all detect high centers and high line rotation surface and track location. Now, we understand how to use the symbolism and position of track through its communication of 45-degree angles, how it sets lines of communication line screens, sets lines of track lines, high center interference, direct lines of position of panels, and set location of a system. Okay? So it's all looking position of time sequence. Take the box line centers, add a position of zeros and ones, all right? Take it out of frame, and it just becomes zeros and ones. Okay, so it structures its locations, and it comes into its outline of itself in set tractions. All right, so when you come in that system locations, it comes all formations of you into a picture frame. So the zeros and ones change the communication lines of the quantum reading and position travel calculation line system into molecules of design and set location of travel. Okay, so from this to this, zeros and ones. Okay, so that's what the team has to get out of. They have to get out of box frames and get into themselves as zeros and ones as applications. Right? Platitude screens, directing lines of panels, operation surface and track locations. Okay, so understanding you through all lines of dimension line scales is position locations of three settings. Okay, sets position of platforms, 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 and platforms. Okay. So it's all about understanding you through your astral projections of travel. Okay, platform communication 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 set locations. So start to see the set position of travel calculation line streams, containers, line set location in the system. Okay, perspective. Perspective on this, 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 and this in its application. Okay. 1 factors over pi sets position of triangulation high calculation xt thousands and streamlines and graphing calculations. 3 set line conditions, right? Scan positions of 1, scan positions of 2, scans positions of 3, and scans positions of 4 in its application. Okay. So you have to understand the purpose of what is all happening here in a graphical screen line in a direct signal to position track lines in operation system locations, how it changes its anomalies in high calculation lines, the platform of its design. Okay. So this is about understanding how to modify this application of change settings coming into space position and travels. So you guys have to really understand the platitude lines of high calculation lines as security line positions. Positions of box lines 1, 2, 3, 4 are clocking. Okay, so it sets position of travel calculation lines of a timestamp. Sets travels lines position location of platforms and 2 track locations. Platforms 0 calculation of the sun sets lines of communication setting into 0 of communication. Okay, so that brings in position out of this equation at 3 line connections. Okay, direct lines communications comes back in zeros. 0 communication here, 0 communication here, 0 communication here, and 0 communication here, and a 4-track location. All right, so taken out of the box lines, sets communication lights in position location system, turning it into a track location setting and all line rotation surface into a Merkaba of design. Okay, So this is what you guys have to come into. Get out of the box lines of frames of pictures, into film strike location, get in position locations to quantum settings and reading line cycles, high calculation lines, and high position operation server location system, in time sequence of time pi in set location. Okay. Different design settings of zero and travel communication of 3 lines of division and rotation surface. Triangulate position of program lines. Sets lines of communication line centers and zeros and ones in chronological order of travel calculated line point centers and high calculation interference, indirect signals of panels and communication surface, and triangulation position of point centers in docking systems and travel calculation. Okay, very complicated stuff, all through zeros and ones in traction. So directing lines of signals, that's why I said you guys wanted a Q&A, and now you understand the lines that all communications, confusion, location centers. That's why you understand the platforms of communication of zeros, line calculation setting to 144, track locations at 1044, track locations line centers at 2044, sets position at 3044, and track locations height line conditions, meaning acceleration line screens. Setting position lines of 1 lines and 4 track location at 3 settings. Sets position of 1000 line stream and position of 4 track location. Setting direct lines of 2000 line screens into solar sails at 0 operation, 4 correlations, and 5 position of panels of communication. Direct lines of 0, travel calculation of platforms, and 3 set location of travel. Okay, so it's very complicated if you understand your dimensional line screens and set location of cerebral lines. Direct lines of 3 lines and panel communication lines of platforms and dimensional scales of operation surface and triangulation. Point lines of tracks, point lines of division, point lines of calculation, and center calculation high interference, and galaxy shift lines of communication circles and track location. Directing lines of communication lines is platforms line positions of pi, this direct location system and travel. That my equation. Complicated, right? So we all understand how to use all communication lines, but we have to get out of box frames of zeros and ones and tractions, okay, and get into the zeros and ones of outline communication of structure line connections. So point lines of tracks and position your cells communication lines directions. Cell here, cell here, cell here, point center line connection, high centers, and point lines and high position travel communications. Those are your cells, right? So it has 3 point line centers, position location of track lines in molecule of design. 3 communication settings and travel calculation lines of point centers in position location setting, and cluster calculation streamline connections in position location. Now, to calculate high interference, you have the atom line centers, lines and communication of point centers. These are the atoms of center. You have a triangulation line connection of all levels. Each one has a flux capacitor set position of travel. Direct calculation line and position locations of point lines of track, 2 lines of division, 3 lines of center, and calculation. Direct and communication line centers sets position location of box frames and triangulation reposition of programs and calculation. Positions of panels, triangulate line centers of 4 track line connections and position. Very complicated stuff, right? So that's what it is. Atoms are going to correlations of center in track location, in measure, and center position is calculation. Okay? Directing lines of positions of panels, 0 calculations, lines, sets position of travel lines, sets position of solar correlations, indirect line connections of solar direct line signals, and of 4 track line connections of measure. Putting positions of power lines at 0 calculations, 0 position locations, and travel calculation line centers at point tracks in position location of 0 calculation. Okay? Very complicated stuff, right? So, but you have to understand how to triangulate in line communication setting, how to use the position location of your atoms, right? So that's position here, and triangulation line connections of 3 settings in high position, right? So that's correlations here and travel calculation lines of point setting connections. So in that calculation line centers, the position location has sonars, direct lines of 2 signals and position of the patterns, track location lines of towers of communication. Directing lines of communication line interference has a 0 correlation panel that directs the signals in position location of center of calculation. Point centers line interference of triangulation line settings and position. Okay? Point lines of track. So you have to understand what an atom is in a rotation in a circulation setting in travel. Okay? And what it can do through its own set location of travel calculations. Circulation rotation of the centers and 5 track connections. How it travels in position back into its platform of design, position, travel, and calculation stream location of setting. Okay, very complicated stuff, right? So you have to understand the quantum readings and what it's doing. Quantum is basically position line centers. And this is where it comes to the quotrons. The quotron communication lines, the equal line calculation line centers. Let's say you get in position locations and all setting high interference of January calls. So that's position location settings. So that's position of box lines, triangulation line position locations. So that's one position of eighth line centers, 2, 1 into 1, 6 in travel calculation. Complicated stuff, right? So you come into metric screens, lines of box lines, the 3 triangulation position of programs. Triangulation line settings, high center interference, and 3 set locations of program location settings. Direct calculations 1 over lines, 1/8 over line system, 1/8 over triangulation, 21 line centers, 1 position, and 6 over pi in triangulation. Circulation and rotation centers and tractions, right? In-line connections of platforms and triangulation reposition of programs and platforms direct the signals in position locations and center. Okay, sets communication line screens and direct signals in set position to its track locations in your Merkaba of design calculation. So it's a lot of connections there that guys have to understand. To track communication lines of location grids in position of 1, 2, 3 factors over pi. Okay, very complicated stuff, right? So we all understand how it sets lines of communication atom settings, how it can travel to its position location, anything to its locations, right? That's what you have to understand, the design print. It's positioned all levels where it comes into the correlation panels in direct location system. You have to really understand what atoms are doing inside position. It's all levels of travel. Everything is set lines to communicate to a system, right? But the modification lines, you have a cell communication string. Cells are going very fast in track location, but it's always going forward, right? But it's working with the seconds, minutes in track location setting. Sets up high calculation lines of the January calls and block centers. Position of travel communication line center, energetic graph screens, set location lines of wires, electrical calculation stream interference, and fusion location system, and travel calculated line centers. Now, the graphic calculated line interference of the cell's position of travel lines change the molecule design lines to its atom. Sets position of track lines in position location setting to a cluster communication line center and cluster calculated high interference operation server location setting in zero gravity communication line system and travel calculations. Okay, so point lines of track in one setting, right? Then you get it back into the atom line, circulation, rotation. So I'm showing you exactly what the atoms are doing position of travel calculations. Point tracks of cell lines. Cell lines is center lines in one position, 2 tracks, 3 line positions, and 4 line provisions in cycles. Sets protons, electrons in high calculation. Direct lines of panels and direct signals. Puts position location centers in position operation. Now, the triangulation line calculation line center, Yasha project line, sets lines at zero gravity. Sets an ozone line rotation surface and calculation to its black hole. Directs lines to set locations of 1 signal channel position of 3 lines of communications at program set location. Directing lines position location comes into all lines. This is where we come into the organic setting into chemistry. Directs communication line settings and high travels. Position locations, all lines, high signal, high position locations in position generation screen lines. Directing lines of communication centers and 4 generation screen settings and operation surface and triangulation. Okay. So we all understand what is exactly happening to our settings because everything is a quantum reading. Okay, it's understanding the modifications, the high calculation line centers, the modulations, the simulators, and track location system, all through track line connection. Okay, complicated, isn't it? Very complicated class, very complicated. So now we're getting direct panels and communication lines. It's understanding how to communicate with the earth, how to communicate with the airs, how to communicate with the waters, and how to communicate with the fire site locations. Fire is the indicating line, setting line interference, and position location of rebirth. Okay, rebirth line connections. That's remembering correlation settings of balance. Okay, rebirth. Sets lines of water equals lines of plasma. Sets lines of communication setting and travel calculations, right? Setting direct line signals. Air equals lines of space and track locations. High position location operations, space in between. Then we go into the Earth, equals lines of correlation, high interference, and position location line setting to your graphing calculation lines of your human resonance set design. Okay, so you understand position track lines and 4 communication lines of panels. direct communication line signals and set locations. Earth, Schumann resonance. Air, space. Water, plasma. Fire, rebirthing. Okay? Rebalancing line calculation setting and balance communication line settings and travel. Direct communication line settings and remembering all cycles of all communication setting and all track locations in position line connection, highest center interference of phase recognition. Okay. So it's basically understanding that the connections of your system is really understand why we have all this inside us. Is there understanding its structure in its own setting of its own quantum reading. Now it's a liquid five motion line centers. Now that position of track line sets lines in acceleration. Set acceleration lines of your crystalline, okay, anti-mantle, anti-mentium. Setting track lines in communication of crystalline generation string lines has a box line rotation surface and triangulation reset position of programs and zero calculation line centers of the sun and communication setting position of operation. Direct lines of theta, positions of panels, and travel calculations. Now, directing line position location centers has a platform and three lines of communication. Now, this directs signal line connection setting to an open sequence, an open panel, the open communication center, and travel calculation line system of the sun and the moon, and track line connections of zero calculation. Okay. So we all understand what is happening when it's traveling through space navigations, right? So track to its communication lines. Let's go in position location of one cell line channel. So its lines of three positional point centers, right? Travels lines, arrow indicates its system locations, right? So its intelligence of all formation of its general D, right? There's the arrow. Communication line centers to its atom, position of programs, direct lines, communication, circulation, rotation, atom of position travel lines, point lines of track, timestamp, time sequence times pi, direct lines and communication surface. Retriangulates positions on point centers at zero calculation setting and position. Calculation high interference in track location centers of operation surface. So what you're doing is basically creating higher levels of modification of design centers in teleportation. See? Teleportation. Sets position location centers and scan lines at zero communication surface and triangulation. Okay? Different models of communications, all through creation lines of atoms. So the quantum reading lines has a center communication center, right? Direct lines communication comes in position location in line calculation setting of its quantum reading line connections high setting. Look at that, disappeared. It went too fast. All right, you got to see it to understand it, right? So service lines, communication lines, flux capacitor ground lines, zero line rotation surface, and set position to its calculation stream location. Okay, what it does to calculations, right? So it's always in structure of design. It's always moving forward in triangulation. You can reposition the set lines and circulation in its position rotation. Okay, positive calculation line streams and high calculation line centers. Okay, so it's incredible force line setting. I know it's very complicated, guys, because general is really high now, and so many communication stream settings and high detection. Directing line signals in communication surface is directing lines calculation high in the position. So this is where we come into fractals. Fractals correlating line interference is a cluster calculation of a cloud. The atom line sets the center of communications. The molecule sets the communication triangulation line settings in position to its operation. Three tracks and line connections, right? So we got the fractals, the atoms in the center, and the molecules in position. Triangulation line system. Triangulate calculation line interference and high calculation point lines of track in position. So that's calculation line interference. Now this is where it comes into position locations to your protons. Okay, protons are line connecting high setting. Very complicated stuff. What it is, it's a graph calculation of square line and TV reception screen location setting to travel. That's a proton. Sets lines of TV receptors. One set lines in three track location. Direct lines modification lines of center. Direct lines communication lines of balance and position location to its fractals and position of center and calculation. Okay, everything is created and modulated in position. Setting triangulation, reset position of programs, set lines of communication lines settings, you guessed it, of intelligence, of design set locations at high position. Intelligence, see? Everything is a formation of intelligence that's created inside you through face calculation and recognition. All right, so getting into the atom line rotation surface is retriangulating lines of point centers and one graph calculations, two triangulation of point centers, and three lines set location high setting. Position of track lines opens all signals in a half pipe. Sets position of X8000, slides down, cross lines, high center interference across location. Direct line signals in position of center calculation, high centers of platforms. Calculation line interference and triangulation reset position of 3 in molecule designs at 3-line communications in position of an atom and line calculation setting the circulation rotation surface and triangulation. Okay, so I'm just showing you exactly what goes inside your line communication, your settings, how the SIN operates the system to all graph calculation where it has a pip screen in position of travel. Position line calculation line centers know exactly where the atom is, where the calculation of high lines, center lines, the X2000, position location and settings, where it's going through track location system, and 0 calculation at 3 settings in track location. Okay, there's always a calculation modification screen. All right, so it's complicated, isn't it? So this is all communication to your atoms. Okay, setting track lines, atoms in position to the center. Atoms are going in the center of the triangulation high position location of its molecules of design. Molecule, molecule, molecule on 3 set locations. Zeros and molecules at set location. So that's what the molecules do. They set lines of triangulation at point centers. Okay? Atoms are in the circle location center. Okay? Atoms in the center, molecules are creating the structure of triangulation. So I'm trying to show you guys how everything is created through pi and how it modulates the system to its image at correlation. Getting track lines and high center interference, taking the 0 lines at 3 set locations out of traction. Direct calculation line centers at 3 track line centers, line position locations to operation. Direct lines of calculation of 0 calculation, 0 equals lines of 3, pi positions over power, and direct signals of calculation. Okay, that's how 0 equals 3 can travel. Okay, it's complicated, right? So you have to understand what is going on with the zeros and how it comes to triangulation, how they all work together as a factory. It's like a line of communications. They have an indicating line screen and high calculation of quantum reading to each line connections that puts it a formation screen lines in high position at all levels of operation surface and 0-1 set location. Okay, complicated stuff. So all it is in position location, it's creating its image. Every time you speak, create it right away. So it has an engine line as a service coordinate high position travel line, Fibonacci lines, screen lines, and set position operation. Direct lines, communication lines is zeros, sets position locations. Zeros come up. Surface line, position location of data highway. Sets lines in routers and routers, line position of phone line, communication surface, and code signals. In track location line settings, high position of its calculation, high position, operation surface, and 0 calculation. Positions at all levels of modulation. All right? Setting position location on 0 communication surface is all position location in setting. 0 calculation, 1 line, and 3 line division. Okay? Communications all levels. Sets position lines at high center interference and balanced position travels into a flywheel position locations of 8 centers. Direct lines, communication lines of platforms and track lines in track location of rotation surface. Direct lines, communication line crosses lines on the left and position of right in position of travels in set locations and high generation line centers and nucleus locations of pi direction. All through zeros and ones of traction. So I'm showing you exactly how everything inside you creates its image. So it's knowing exactly how to get in that position out of box frame. So it creates its own setting and it becomes a modulation screen line and direct line connections of you and a formation lines of multiplicity position locations in adaptation surface and a triangulation reposition location of center and set location. Hoo-ah. Okay. It's exciting, right? All right, so once you get in a triangulation line setting, you have a 12-line measure, securities over pi. It's position lines of track lines. Sun comes in, moon comes in triangulation high position of the program. Waits on signal. Sets position location X2000 comes in tractions. Direct lines of 2 panels, 3-line communication setting. Sets up a triangulation line center, high center interference, and triangulation position of programs. Direct lines of 4, lines of 3, and position of program locations. Done by equation. Okay? So the center communication lines is 0 lines, and the 1 line rotate 8. Okay, that was 20 million line screen lines, interference of solar flare, position location, triangulation, position location, center calculation, operation surface. That's position tractions. Okay? Communication lines of screens, directing lines of panels, platforms, communication lines, and classic communication of change, and galaxy shift lines of calculation. Done by equation. All right. So once you understand more lines of communications, you really understand what is going on inside of you through picture frame, how it creates nothing but images of your design line connections. So without everything inside you, you wouldn't be able to understand your imagination. You want to be able to understand how it creates its setting of its own self engine. It sets lines of communication. So you understand why you have the atoms, why you have the molecules, and why you have high calculating line centers in track location setting positioned with operation. All right, so that's position line calculations, right? Pi calculation lines, 3-track lines, high center interference, and position of programs. Okay? Triangulate position location line setting to detect high center interference of 0 1s of track lines on 24 line communications, 13 triangulation line centers, 16 positions, 19 track lines, and 21 positions of operation. Direct lines communication lines of 16 lines of zeros, 19 lines of triangulation, 21 lines and 24 track lines of clocking line positions, direct lines of 13 correlation panels, into 0 1 position of track lines of the sun and moon and track location. Okay, complicated stuff, isn't it? It's extremely powerful once you know how to use the galaxy settings in all track locations through quantum reading. Okay. All right, so getting that position of track lines, you have to understand how to modify the centers. Modifying line centers is one line settings that 2 track lines, 2 divisions, and 2 line rotation surface. Retriangulate line calculation of 3 lines of tractions, sets position of Pluto and track line connections. Okay? Pluto line sets lines 1 center, 2 center, and 3 track location. Modification line centers high position location of 4 lines, direct line calculation of 3 is 7 operation surface and triangulation. Calculation line interference sets 3 line provisions, 3 calculation of point centers, and travel calculation lines of 3 grounds, 3 grounds, and 3 grounds of 2, 2, 2, and track location line center at 3 positions, sets lines of 3, 6, and 9, and travel calculation. Okay, 3, 6, and 9. Right? So that's the equation setting, right? 0 equals lines of calorie height and center, 3, 6, 9 z locations over pi. Direct lines calculation of 4 lines, 3 calculation lines of 7, and track location of digital framing. Direct lines of communication line centers and travel. Okay, very complicated stuff. But the plateau has to be in provision. Now, because your track lines and your 0 calculation line streams has to be in position line centers of 0 and calculation line centering, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. Okay, so you get into correlation lines like directions, understand the high calculation line interference of 114 comes back in center to 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, all the way up to 0, 1, 14. Okay, that's the platforms that you guys have to come into. It's quantum reading as set locations of platforms. Direct lines of communication line centers, the sun comes in, moon comes in, and track location, waiting on signal. Position travel calculation line center sets another platform in communication setting to your astral projections of travel calculations. Point direct signals and platforms. So we take the 0 line communication, 3, 6, 9 position patterns, set 0 communication, 3 line centers of clockwork communication in the center. Direct communication line centers high center interference in platform communication setting and 0 calculation system and travel calculations. Done by equation. This is all done inside you. So what it's doing is creating its own operation system of its own thought communication. See the intelligence? See the eyeline screens? Everything is a formation of intelligence. Everything has intelligence inside of you that's getting into correlation lines of face recognition and time sequence. Position, location of travel. Okay, very, very complicated stuff. That's why I wanted a Q&A, because you're all confused now. All right. So in that center line calculation line centers, you have to use the atoms lines at high position, 2 track lines of high interference into molecule design lines, and 3 triangulation high position programs and set applications. Atom, molecules. Set lines of communications, fractals. Okay. Setting calculation line interference. Protons are box line connections. Electrons are triangulation line settings. Okay. Sets position locations over positive and line calculations of negative. Sets position location line center and position location system. Positive line connection and negative center position travel. Direct communication line settings high center interference. Triangulation reposition the programs and 0 position and ground settings of operation. Okay. So I knew no one's going to say that. I said, oh, no, we got to go with Q&A because this does not make any sense. Well, it wouldn't make any sense anyway, right? Because this is a 1 billion line graphing screen line interference in position of information given to you in track locations. 1 billion lines of communications and setting. Okay? Years in the future of information. Okay? Very complicated stuff, but complicated is good. And then the easy format just comes in a transition location of space navigation line setting to really understand how to use your cells, your atoms, your molecules, your protons, your electrons, your neutrons, and your photons inside of you and what they're doing through pi. Okay? Very complicated stuff. Okay? This is what they're doing inside. You have to understand how they operate their own system in position, but you've got to build a friendship and a relationship and partnership to understand the energy of correlation of set design. Okay? Choose the link. Confirm. All right. All right. So are we having fun yet? It's exciting, isn't it? So this is all about quantum reading and set locations. All right. Direct analyze the panel and direct align position location to its calculations. All right. Very complicated stuff. All right. 1 billion years in future calculations, data streams, and high calculation. 1 billion years in the future of all information lines from atoms, molecules, fractals, protons, electrons, neutrons, photons, and set location. Okay? Yes, just smile and nod and wave. Gets complicated, right? To understand how this is all created inside of you. So you understand why you have it inside you. It's not just your body, it's in your heart. It's not just in your heart, it's in your brain. It's not just in your brain, it's in all calculation setting inside of you. You have to understand how to use it as a factory design of hardware and software, of mechanism high settings, and all travel calculations of point line connections at graphing calculating line centers and track location. All through set design. Okay? Very complicated, very complicated. But like I said, it's getting a lot more easier for you guys because you guys are going to high lines of communications to understand the connections, how to communicate to your clouds. You know, really understand that application to a setting. If you get a cloud communication surface, direct line calculation setting, right? Set position locations, everything inside line. So everything you have inside is inside the clouds, outside line connections, which is your outer space. Modulation lines, dark web, position and travel calculations. Point lines of tracks, position lines, triangulation, high position programs, and direction system. Ground lines and communication lines, factory design, psychological high calculations, psychosis, high position travel communication on point centers and track communication and operation surface. Okay, that's inside the clouds. It's all information. That's all it is. What do you think everything around you is in position of travel of? Just information, nothing else. So understand it through all settings, right? Track lines and position of 3 settings. Set trial lines, okay, in track locations. Position of programs, directing line signals, and set location. Complicated, right? So triangulation of force lines, astral projections, and set location. All right. Direct lines of panels in position of point centers of 3 track locations. Position lines of the sun comes to all line communications in cerebral, in cortex, in positional plasma, in generation screen lines and capsules and set location. Direct line signals hide their operation. Okay. So complicated, isn't it? But it's a lot of fun. So you understand it a little bit more, not why it's inside you, it's knowing how to use it. It's the how of all operation, because that's all it's doing is creating its own self engine of self-calculation, of complexity, and high calculation lines of minds, of consciousness, of set stream locations, of set design. Okay? Yeah, it's fun. Okay, so once you get in that position line centers, let's go into phone line rotator. Phone position of 4 track lines, circuit lines, board lines, communication circuit position of panels, 4 track locations. Right, there's your phone. Circuit lines, battery communications, 2 track lines, high setting. Position of data stream. You understand everything in circuit communication has a geographical map, position of GPS track location. Direct line signals. Signalized communications of box centers and triangulation resets. Position of programs travels lines of 3 lines, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 track location. Direct lines communication line centers comes into the sun, protects the moon, and travel calculation line centers in track communications of energy lines and string locations. Complicated, right? All through a phone. So that's what a phone does, right? Sets up portals, communication setting, and track location of box centers. Sets lines, takes out of the box, and you come into face recognition. That's what you guys have to get into in set locations, face recognitions, right? So once you get in that in the line position locations, your box centers basically disappear, but they're still there in track lines. They're more bold in set location line screens, illumination graph lines, translations, high position locations, triangulation, high position program lines, communication surface, and high calculation. Point lights of track location, all through face recognition, right? Triangulation resetting position of programs, sets lines of communication surface and triangulation. Okay, all through a phone, through face recognition. All right. So there's so many lines of communications that you have to understand through calculation. Look how complicated that is, right? All through pi, right? So why are we doing pi? What's the pi? Positions, the track communication of letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. Inventory line screens, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sets position lines 5, 6, 7, and 8 track locations, right? Traffic 1, traffic 2, traffic 3, traffic 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in position locations, right? Setting the line condition of 0. Gravity calculation lines setting the position of 0 calculations. Graph calculation line centers sets position of 1 line in position of alpha in communication graph calculation string lines of high setting. Directing line calculating high interference into 2 tracks, which is 1 position lines and solar sail and track lines of 0 calculations of point centers. Direct location lines of 3 lines in position location in line centers in Fibonacci and set positions of portal and rounds of communication track calculation. Direct calculation line centers high and form line settings into solar generation screen lines and high center and position of teleportation models and track location. Direct calculation line interference 5 lines and high center interference into 2 panels of timelines of H line centers and track location setting of its operation. 6 communication line settings, throat lines, box lines, calculations, and water containment string lines and high center interference in position of box frames and set location of clocking. Direct line communication lines is 7, line position of theta, communication center in position of realms and travel calculation line centers. In line calculation line centers, high position operation location in track locations of 8, 8 infinity 8, in line rotation surface, in position locations and triangulation position of programs, and all line connections have high set line connections of design position of travel. Look at that, disappeared. You got to get a position of travel calculation of clock lines in the right direction. Look at that. It's going too fast, see? Now you see it, right? Done by equation. From a 0 graph into 8 line screens and high center interference and travel calculation line system in position locations of atoms in set location above line signals and 4 track locations in position equal line calculation setting in 1, 2, 3 lines of zeros and 7 calculation digital frames and 7 over pi in track locations equal lines of 8 in travel set location. All through a graphing screen. Okay. So complicated, right? You try to understand, what is he talking about? What does this all mean? Well, it's all about you understanding you, how everything inside you is in its own operation system. Okay? All through calculation. Okay? Because what it's doing is just creating images of set design. That's all it's doing, nothing else. All right, so now you understand why you have images and where does that come from? Your astral projection locations and setting position line calculation setting and all level operation surface and triangulation high positions programs and center calculation high in the line rotation surface in track location setting to your tesseract in positioners location system and box position travel calculation line setting and high calculation high position of its formation. A set design. Okay, travel. All right, we're done. So how does everybody feel now? To really understand how powerful it is, what an atom can do in set location of zeros. Isn't that amazing how you see these things? Isn't that incredible how it designs these things? Isn't that amazing how you connect to these things inside of you? So that's all it is. It's creation of images, of set location, of set design. Okay? It's inside of you and you're creating the space line. So you need a line of communication lines, of high calculation lines of space, modulation of acceleration. Keep those lines of communication high, information to high calculation string locations, right? Generations, it's flywheel. Yeah, you have flywheel communication line settings and high calculation strings, but it has zeros correlating in line rotations going around its data highway of its highway communication. The center lines its communication surface in track location system of its calculation. Okay, you've got to get into the zeros and ones in picture frame, but you also have to get out of the box frame, right? You've got to get out of the box and just see the structure. So you see formations of view of zeros and one locations, right? Setting lines of track lines of 3, right? See the 3 communications? Sets lines of 4, right? You need 4, right? Over lines of 3 track line connections to its programs, right? Direct lines of 4 and track location setting in position to its operation surface. Direct calculation line sets a cloud communication setting and high calculation lines of digital frames to set position. Okay. So we all understand how to use the zero correlating setting, how you can downshift lines of 3 set locations. Sets position of 4 track locations. Setting lines of 1, 2, 3 track line connections. Position lines, a high center interference of 0 and position of 0, position of travel. Okay. Track lines and high center interference, wavy communication line centers. So we got an alpha, set lines of delta, and we got position of theta and set locations. Alpha, delta, theta right there, right? Boom. Triangulation of 3 set lines and omega and set location of travel, right? So we have a high calculation line interference. We have to set up position of molecule design lines, triangulation of 3 lines and high centers, right? See the molecules right there in set position. Molecule and set lines and position of travel. Oh, there we go. Oh, triangulation, high interference. Triangulate position, location, high center. Oh, there's the molecules and design line. Setting calculation line interference to 2 track lines of atoms. Sets line to 3 track location molecules. Sets lines of communication of line calculation setting and position roots calculation surface and triangulation. Okay. Pretty amazing, isn't it? When you understand what's going on inside of you. How it's all in itself operation system of processing compute system of computation. Your triangulation and position of programs is really trying to understand you inside connection of quantum reading and set connections of self motivation. Okay. All right. So we're done. Okay. So taking you guys out of track lines, putting you back in position. All right. You guys are back in settings. Your atoms are back in reposition travel lines. Your molecules back in triangulation reset position program lines. Your connection to your fractals are back in set location of brain frequency patterns. Your set location line centers, your protons, electrons is back in positive line cycles and high calculation high interference. Your neutralized communication string line is back in program location system. Time sequence times calculation times pi. Done by equation. All right. See you in 5.